Now it's time to look at the use of carbohydrates during exercise. This particular video is probably going to take a little bit more than 15 minutes, I'll warn you now. The metabolism of carbohydrates does start with glycolysis, and we utilize or store carbohydrates in the form of glycogen. It's stored in the muscle for use during exercise and in the liver to maintain blood glucose. Carbohydrates play a role in metabolism or energy production at rest and during exercise. When we get to very high intensity exercise, it becomes the primary source of ATP production. However, the stores are relatively limited. As we look at our graph here, with red being the contribution to fat, the carbohydrates shown in the blue line, we'll see that as the exercise intensity, which would be at the bottom line, as you get higher to maximum, the amount of fat contribution steadily decreases to near zero when you are at 100% power or maximum oxygen consumption. Carbohydrates increase as you increase exercise intensity, and you'll see that there is kind of a crossover point right around 40% of VO2 or oxygen consumption where that change occurs, where carbohydrates become more prevalent or predominant. As a person trains, that those values shift a little bit, and you have that crossover point a little bit later. So it's important to have high storage. The more storage that you have, the better performance that you'll have for duration of time specifically. When we compare the time or the initial stored muscle glycogen, if a person is on a high carbohydrate diet, moderate carbohydrate diet, or a low carbohydrate diet, we'll see that the individual will have a lower total work time in minutes. So the open dot, the farthest to the left, that would be a person on a low carbohydrate diet, which means they have less stored in their muscle before exercise, that their work time is approximately 60 minutes. If someone is at a moderate carbohydrate diet, they have 2 grams per 100 grams of muscle, they can go about 2 hours. A person on a high carbohydrate diet, which has much greater muscle storage, their work time is even greater. So we've got, it looks like it's a continuous line. It's a little misleading here, but it's showing the relationship between beginning muscle glycogen or glucose storage and time to be able to do exercise at any given exercise intensity. The data is clear. Carbohydrate is going to improve endurance performance. In fact, if somebody consumes carbohydrates during extended exercise, and in this case longer than 2 hours, a person is going to prevent low blood sugar or hypoglycemia, be able to maintain carbohydrate metabolism, delay fatigue, and feel that they're not exercising as hard. So you've got many reasons why it's going to be beneficial to consume carbohydrate, especially when you do exercise to exhaustion and also a time trial. Now for endurance exercise, it's really clear. For team or intermittent type sports, it's a little bit harder, so it's more difficult to have a clear recommendation, although when we get to those topics, I'll have something for you. The outcome on intermittent high-intensity exercise has been, results show that it does seem to help when someone has a carbohydrate consumption versus a placebo. So here we have on a continuum, we have field sports, which are more short distance with bursts with football, field sports that require endurance like soccer, batting sports, and court sports. There is these 4 different categories depending on the energy demand, distance covered, duration. It's going to depend on how it's going to be beneficial. We can extrapolate from some of the findings that we have to identify that intermittent high-intensity exercise can be beneficial when you have that high burst exercise, that carbohydrates are going to help with those sports. Certainly not going to hinder. The amount that should be consumed, and this is from that chart that we looked at earlier in the previous presentation, the carbohydrate targets and the type of activity. Long, extreme activities over 4 to 5 hours, we're looking at 8 to 12 grams per kg per body weight. And we also want to make sure that we have a good base before that individual heads out. So to support the energy demands, we make those recommendations based on body weight, but we also have to alter based upon the athlete's needs and make these adjustments where to be, what to have that individual concern. So there's trial and error that's involved. In the days leading up to a competition, we want to have familiar foods, lower fiber, good carbohydrate, maybe 70 or more, 70 to 75% carbohydrates, and consider the work that's been done, and this is shown through carbohydrate loading. Now this next slide is going to have a lot in it. I'm going to recommend that you look at it a little bit more closely in your textbook. But you've got the different regimens of carbohydrate loading, and there are really the protocol varies whether it's the classic, a 6-day, a classic 3-day, a modified 3-day, or a 1-day. And what you'll see is in the classic carbohydrate loading regimens, you have to deplete before you load, which is very, very uncomfortable. A person does some exhaustive exercise and they start with a very low level of glycogen, and that turns on the storage enzymes. So when you feed the carbohydrate, it loads on, it's like super saturated. What we know is that we've got really good results from just a 1-day with no exercise for 1 day, and then have 1 day of really high carbohydrate and be able to load that 10 grams of carbohydrate per kg per day. Now, when you do carbohydrate load, it is possible when you eat that high carbohydrate to you can have some bloating and some water retention, which can be uncomfortable. So this is it's a science of figuring out, or an art determining what's going to be best, but we can definitely look at eating more carbohydrate to kind of top off the reserves that we have in our muscle and in our liver. So you have a normal, good carbohydrate diet. As you get a week before your event, you're looking at tapering, putting more carbohydrate in your tank, exercising and stimulating that uptake, but doing it at a much lower intensity. Now you're up to a day before, 4 to 24 hours. Balance, familiar foods, higher intake. And here are some values. 1 to 4 hours, 3 to 4 grams per kg of body weight. Notice again we're looking at low fiber foods and potentially more complex, not simple carbohydrates. Now this is something that needs to be experimented with, but what you might find is that a beverage may be better tolerated as you get closer to the event. So a carbohydrate beverage, one fluid before exercise might be tolerated better. And you'll see in your book that there's some suggestions about exercise or breakfast in terms of bagel, pancakes, fruit, toast, peanut butter, whatever that person can tolerate. When you get within an hour of the exercise, it's going to be a window that is going to be determined by the athlete's preference and tolerance. Now, if the athlete is not going to be able to or will not consume fuel during their training, it's especially important to get some in closer to the beginning of the event. 25 to 30 grams of carbohydrate is thought to be a good amount less than an hour before exercise. Now, what can happen if somebody consumes carbohydrate, or when you consume carbohydrate, your insulin level spikes, which causes the blood glucose to be pulled into the cells. That could cause a rebound low blood glucose or rebound hypoglycemia. But it appears that that's not as problematic as it once thought that it was. Things to consider is low fiber, low fat, low protein, because it's going to slow the digestion, absorption, and it can also cause discomfort for the athlete. There are the delivery of the carbohydrate can be a gel, a bar, or a drink, but it needs to be something rapidly available, rapidly accessible, easily digested. And so dextrose, sucrose, maltodextrin, those gels, a beverage, something that's going to be tolerated well. It's just going to be based upon what the individual feels most comfortable with and the kind of exercise that they're doing. During exercise, there is a maximal amount of absorption in the GI tract, and it's 1 to 1.1 grams per minute. So dosing heavy, overdosing or overconsumption is not going to, it's actually going to slow down the absorption or interfere with absorption. When it's consumed, if a person is exercising for a long period of time, the fluids really help to maintain hydration and carbohydrate delivery. And the sooner you start consuming, the better. So begin soon and be consistent throughout. And that's why water stations are placed specifically at races. So here you go, short duration, carbohydrate not really needed. Here 30 to 75 minutes, mouth rinse, and a mouth rinse is 5 to 10 seconds where you allow it to go in and then spit it out. That allows enough carbohydrate to get in, and the amount increases between 30, 60, and 90 depending upon the duration of the exercise. So that mouth rinse has been shown to be helpful when you're exercising also at a high intensity and for 30 to 60 minutes. And it's about 5 to 10 seconds of rinsing, and it can help to delay fatigue, have better performance. So it is showing that it's potentially beneficial. This shows you what happens to your blood glucose with a placebo, or if you have a beverage that has carbohydrate. And because we've got a limited absorption, 6% carbohydrate drinks are about it. If you get too high of carbohydrate concentration, your gut will clench. It is very uncomfortable, and it's actually counterproductive. So here we have our blood glucose level at the start of exercise being, if it's red, it's an individual is consuming a beverage. If they are consuming simply water, that is the blue. You can see at little over 2 hours, a person consumes that carbohydrate drink, and up the blood glucose level goes. And you can notice also that the individual could perform or could maintain exercise for 210 minutes, where the person who simply drank water at the 2-hour point, the blood glucose significantly dropped, and that's what those stars are, and they fatigued much earlier. So a carbohydrate beverage is going to have a ability to maintain that blood glucose and delay fatigue. After competition, well, it takes about 20 or more hours to get full glycogen replenishment. And the replenishment is going to be, or the enzymes are working at their fastest immediately post-exercise. So it's important to get that carbohydrate early after exercise is completed. Liquid or solid. Now, some people will want to drink fluid because of the hydration and the cooling component that goes along with it. So that is something to consider. If there is a little protein in your beverage, that's going to help with protein synthesis as well. If somebody can have chocolate milk post-exercise, then that's great too. If the recovery time is short recovery time, and we're talking athletes that have multiple events in a day, then you want to have that after your first event, you want to get in that carbohydrate of 1 to 1.2 grams per kg per hour every hour for the first 4 to 6 hours post-exercise. Then you should be able to just have your resume regular practice after the event. So if you've got a 2 a day, that carbohydrate's going to be necessary. A good dose in between the practice or the games will be important. If you have greater recovery time, still you want to make sure that you're getting that high post-exercise carbohydrate. You need to get to your daily needs, and it takes 20 to 24 hours to get the glycogen back to good standards. However, if somebody's been on a low carbohydrate diet, it'll take longer. Here's a summary. So 1 to 4 hours before, your value, 1 to 4 grams per kg. You're less than an hour before, 25 to 30. Take a dose. During exercise, depending upon how long, if it's 30 to 60 minutes, or if it's, over 60 minutes, 30 to 60 grams per hour. If somebody's exercising longer than that, we're looking at 90. After exercise, 1 to 1.1, 1.2 grams per kg, especially if you have a short recovery time, and if your recovery time is greater than 8 hours, you want to plan adequately to make sure you're getting enough carbohydrate that following during that time to replenish your glycogen. I have this quick little video linked in e-learning to take a look at. It's a really nice Gatorade Sports Science Institute video to look at. And so as you look at the nutrition coach, you have a 15-year-old soccer player, midfield. You think about what a midfield athlete does. She's feeling really fatigued, and you'll see that she has decreased her carbohydrate intake from 65% of her total intake to 40%. And she's feeling really fatigued in the middle of her 2 to 3 hour practices and weekend games. So as you can imagine, because she's carbohydrate lean, she's having fatigue issues, duration of exercise is suffering, and she's not feeling well. So she doesn't like sports drinks, and so now she's going to try orange juice. Orange juice is fructose, and just drinking that fructose is going to cause cramping. So we got to figure out something else that she can consume. So you're going to think about what is causing her earlier than usual fatigue, and what might you suggest to her to get her back to peak performance. So from the readings and from the two presentations, I hope that you have an idea of how to help this individual improve her preparation and her performance utilizing carbohydrate foods and beverages. See you next time.